what we're practicing here is to sit still and be silent. And we're practicing that because there's something that becomes available when you sit still and be silent. And it may not be something that's available right away. You may have to practice sitting still and being silent for a while for you to be able to notice what's there when you're sitting still and being silent. And part of what's necessary for this to work is when you're sitting still and being silent, you will notice that thinking keeps calling you. Thinking keeps calling your attention. And so you're sitting still being silent, and we're paying attention to being aware of the body breathing. So we have some grounding, some way to ground our attention, right? So our attention doesn't keep flittering all over the place. So we begin to sit still and be silent and focus attention on the awareness of the body sitting there breathing as a point to focus. Otherwise, the attention would just keep moving all over the place. So we're trying to get stable here. And even when we do that, thinking will call the attention. And so the attention goes to thinking. Why? Because thinking is our default way of functioning in the world. We think. We think we think. We don't actually think, but we think we think. And it's a habit, right? And it's something that we're so used to doing that it wouldn't even occur to a lot of people that there was anything other than thinking. So when thinking calls our attention, in order to get the value of being still and sitting silent, we want to bring the attention back away from that, back to the belly breathing. And this will be necessary over and over again during the time we're sitting, because we're trying to break away from the habit of being a thinker and using thinking as a way of being. Thinking is not a way of being. Thinking is a way of doing. You're doing thinking, and then you do actions, you do behaviors. So the point of the whole thing is that if we can be silent and still and practice experiencing what's possible, practicing what's available when we're silent and still, and we get enough of an experience of that it becomes evident to us that when we're being silent and still and we're away from the thought activity, right, there is something there. There is an experience that's there, and the experience that's there could be called emptiness, or could be called awareness, or could be called being. And so this experience that's there is an experience that allows us to discover that the reality of what we are is not offered by thought. The reality of what we are is only available if we're still and silent and available to recognize it. It's not offered by thought, because thought is what has told us, we have thought that we're a body, and we have thought that we're a personality. The teachings tell us that's a mistake. It's an inevitable mistake, because it's necessary in order to function in the world. But it won't provide for us the possibility of well-being. It won't provide for us the possibility of being satisfied, happy, peaceful, calm, and clear. It won't provide that. It will never provide that. And that's the thing that we want to be clear about, right? Why? Because if we're clear about that, then we understand this practice is offering us the possibility of experiencing well-being, something that we all want. Right? Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to be peaceful. Everybody wants to be satisfied, right? And so this practice of sitting still and being silent and practicing being away from the thinking activity allows us to recognize the truth, allows us to recognize our true nature is this emptiness, this stillness, this peacefulness, this silence, this experience of well-being. It's very satisfying to experience this experience. And then if we stay with it over time through practice, it begins to become evident that this experience is happiness. The experience itself is happiness. It's not some happiness. We discover that happiness is not something that we can get like we don't have it. No, we discover that happiness is the experience of what we are. Why? Because the awareness that is our true nature is inherently happy to exist. That's what the happiness is about, happiness to exist. And so when we become familiar with that, we become familiar with the possibility of having everything that we've ever wanted by doing nothing. Having everything we've ever wanted by just sitting still and allowing ourselves, to not be distracted, allow ourselves to be open and receptive to what's there when we're sitting still and being silent and not thinking. And the more we practice this, the clearer it becomes that this is available at all times, right? So that we can, instead of formally practicing it, it starts to become a way of being that's available to us at all times when we're in life and dealing with all of the challenges of a human life. It's available to us at all times. This is the beginning of an experience of the truth. Now, I have made the statement that if you try to meditate, that's not meditation, okay? If you sit still and you practice being silent and still, and you're following the technique, right? So you're following the technique. In that experience of being that you're having, doing happens, but you're not doing it. This is what part of what this possibility makes available, is that you begin to have an experience of being, right, that's natural, and that experience of being that is natural is like dancing. You're not trying to get anywhere. You're not trying to do anything. When you dance, if you're really freely dancing, really letting your body dance, right? You're not trying to dance, you're just dancing. You're not trying to get to the end of the dance. No, you're enjoying the moment of dancing, right? And so that's a similar experience to what we're talking about here. And while you're dancing, you may be doing things you learned as far as dance is concerned, but while you're actually dancing, you're not doing that, you're dancing. You get this? Yeah, you learn how to dance, right? You may learn how to do certain movements in dance by watching other people dance and and all that jazz, right? So that when you go to dance, you may be doing those movements, right? But while you're dancing, you're not doing dancing, you're being dancing. Because it's not going anywhere, it's happening. That's what makes dancing pleasurable and enjoyable, right? Because you're letting go and you're letting your body, do what it is doing naturally in relationship to the music or whatever, right? But the experience you're having is transformational when you're dancing because you're not trying to dance, you're letting yourself dance. You're letting dancing happen. And while you're letting dancing happen, you may do things that you have learned to do, but you're not doing them now, you're just dancing. You get that? And the reason we talk about practice is because what is practice? Practice is repeating something, isn't it? It's just repeating something. Well, why are we practicing something that is natural? Good question. Why are we practicing something that's natural? Because we're practicing because we want to retrain our brain. The brain needs repetition, right? In order to get into a habit, it needs repetition, right? So we want to keep repeating this sitting still, being silent, moving attention away from thinking, So we can train this brain, right, to be reprogrammed to be consistent with reality, right? So that we don't have to deal with it the way we have to deal with informal meditation, which means we have to keep moving away from it, right? But if over time we keep practicing and repeating this over and over again, gradually the brain starts to reorganize itself to be consistent with reality, to be consistent with the truth, which means that we have less of an issue with thinking. That the mind quiets down, the mind calms down. So one of the things that's an offering is offered through this practice of sitting still, being silent, and moving away from thinking over time, is to have a quiet mind. Not to have that voice in your head talking to you all the time about what should be that's not, and who you should be that you're not, and and complaining about stuff, and talking to you, explaining to you about what you're seeing and what you're doing all the time. It's the interpreter of reality to you. And when you wake up through the process of practicing sitting still and being quiet, right, you discover you don't need an interpreter. You don't need the voice in your head to interpret what's happening. You can see it for yourself. And when you see it for yourself, you're seeing it more realistically than the voice is interpreting it, right? It's interpreting what you're seeing based on a program that's running called survival, which means that what it tells you it's seeing is not what's happening, it's what it says is happening in terms of, is it a threat to you, right? So the voice in your head is preoccupied all the time with being concerned about threats, be concerned about who's out to hurt me, right? Or what's going to hurt me, or what's going to kill me, or what's going to make me sick, or what's going to cause me pain, right? The voice is constantly busy with that situation. And so it keeps you in a survival mode. It keeps you in a mode where you're resisting and rejecting things, right? Because they don't fit your ideas about it, right? And when a lot of the stuff that you resist and you reject is really not a threat to you, right? But you're confused because you don't know the difference between you and the program that's running in your brain. So this is about waking up and getting free from that so you can be related to life the way life actually is, instead of being related to life like it's a dangerous situation that's out to get you, right? That's why we wake up in the morning concerned. Wake up in the morning, oh, what's going to happen to me today, Are people going to be mean to me? Am I going to have an accident today? Am I going to get a diagnosis of cancer today? So we have these concerns, When you go to the doctor, your blood pressure goes up because you're afraid he's going to tell you something about your early demise. I'm just here. And when I'm just here as the awareness, I see everything happening, right? But I'm not related to it in a way where I'm afraid of it. I'm not related to it in a way where I identify with it. I'm just watching the whole thing happen. That's all. No, you don't want the interpreter to disappear. You just want the interpreter to start working for you instead of you're being a slave to it.
Okay.
Yeah. See, the voice in your head is innocent, right? It's just the voice of a program, right? A program doesn't have malicious intention, it's just a program, right? And that program got put in place, through your orientation to the world, right? And it had to be so, because in order to function in the world, you have to identify yourself with a physical body. That's your piece on the game board. Without that, you can't play the game. You have to identify with the physical body. Then you have to identify with the personality, right? The personality is the act that's the character you're going to play in this movie. Is your personality, right? So that has to form, that has to formulate, right? And when that formulates and you take on that identity, right, that identity now is separated from reality. That identity now is operating in a particular way that has to do with the human life, right? Has to do with the life of a physical body, the life of a personality in the world, right? So that allows for a human life, right? But it's not fulfilling. It's not fulfilling, It's something that involves coping and struggling and suffering and trying to get it to work, right? and dealing with this every day, and that creates stress, and that creates uncomfortable experiences like anxiety and depression, right, and annoyance, right, and anger and upset and despair, right? And even all those things that it creates are not accidental and not problematic, because by design, they will stimulate you to want to wake up. That's the purpose of suffering. Purpose of suffering is so you can be motivated to move on to the next phase of life. Right? And when you're motivated to move on to the next phase of life because of maybe desperation, a lot of times when people are in desperation, that's when they start seeking, right? Oh, is there anything else? Is there any possibility here? Or is this, I just got to suffer this way, you know? Yeah, so the moving on means moving on to the next phase of life, and the next phase of life is to wake up and remember the truth that you had to forget to think that you're a person. Remember the truth that you had to forget to think that you're a person. And when you remember the truth that you had to forget to think you're a person, right, now a whole new possibility for your life opens up, right? And the personality now goes to school. The personality now starts to get trained, right, to function in a realistic way in the world, right? Starts to get trained. So then you're paying attention, right? The awareness is in a natural state, seeing things as they are, and when the awareness sees the personality is operating out of survival when it's not necessary, when the awareness sees that the personality is being crazy, being neurotic, right? It withdraws its interest in that because it knows that that produces nothing but suffering. It's like the Buddha said, you know, the source of suffering is desire. That was misunderstood by a lot of people, because what he meant by that is that the source of suffering is wanting things to be different than they are, which means you desire them to be different, you see? So that's what he said, desire. I mean, wanting things to be different, wanting to be somewhere else is, you know, desire, like that. And then he went on to say that the resolution of suffering, right, has to do with the understanding that there has been a mistake made in terms of your identity. It was a necessary mistake, but nonetheless a mistake, because it's not true that you're the personality in the physical body. And through practice and by studying the teachings and developing a deep understanding of these things, right, you're on a path. By studying the teachings and developing a deep understanding of these things and starting to practice your way out of trouble, you're now, what they say, walking a spiritual path, right? You're walking a path away from suffering and toward fulfillment, right? And your life becomes this process of walking the path away from suffering and toward fulfillment. And it starts to be an ever-present aspect of your life as a human being, so that at some point, instead of your being a human being, it flips. At some point, instead of your being a human being, right, you're being human instead of a human being. See, if it's a human being, then your identity is the body and the personality. That's a human being, right? Through the practices in these teachings, that flips, and instead of being a human being, you are the awareness being human. It's the awareness being human, right? And so the being human is a limited expression of the awareness, but you have the experience, the full experience of the awareness available to you at all times, which means you can have well-being, and you can be human, and you can function in time and space, and you can enjoy the experience of being in this world, right, without suffering. So that's what's being offered. And if you hear this, if you get the message, right, if you get the, what did one of my teachers, Paul Hederman, call it, I'm serving you a spiritual subpoena. I'm serving you a spiritual subpoena, right? So you're being called to be held accountable for your predicament. You're being called to be held accountable for your predicament, right? And you're going to be held accountable for ignorance, right? And you're being held accountable to come out of the ignorance into the light, to come out of the darkness into the light, so that you can experience what's actually possible for yourself. Kabish? Language is the language of the personality, right? Language is is what the personality uses to be in the world, is language, which is dualistic, right? Right? The language is designed to be dualistic, meaning that anybody who speaks this language is experiencing being the subject, and the object is everything that's not them. The language is consistent with that, isn't it? It's consistent with that I am talking and you're not talking. I am here and you're not me. You're something other than me. And all the language is consistent with that way of understanding reality, right? And so what happens is when you wake up, you're still using the conventional language that we all use, right? But you don't believe it anymore. You don't believe it anymore. You're just using it because it's a practical way of functioning in the way the world is, that's all. But you don't believe the language anymore. You don't believe, when you say I, you don't believe, you no longer mean me, the separate one that's separate from you and the whole world. You don't mean that anymore when you say I. You're just using a convention. That's the way we talk. That's the way humans talk, that's all. But you're not human anymore. You know, when they asked the Buddha when he woke up, are you human? And he said, no, I'm not human. And he said, well, what are you? And he said, I'm awake. So that's what we're up to here.